Gabe Gutierrez is in Ripon, Wisconsin, ahead of Kamala Harris's event with Liz Cheney. And Garrett Haake is following the Trump campaign in Michigan. Gabe, let me start with you. As we've said, former Congresswoman Cheney is joining the vice president at the birthplace of the Republican Party in Wisconsin. How big of a moment is this for the Harris campaign, and how did they get here?
Well, Kristen, the Harris campaign views this as a very significant moment. As you said, they are trying to get those disillusioned Republican voters who are sick of Donald Trump, frankly, to come vote for them. And the question is, Kristen, whether they will be able to convince enough to make a difference in this election. Now, looking around this venue, this is Ripon College, as you said, this town, the birthplace, known as the birthplace of the Republican Party back in 1854. The signage we're seeing over and over throughout this venue is "Country Over Party," and that's a slogan that you would hear from somebody like John McCain, but not something you're hearing a lot now from the current Republican Party, and that's what the Harris campaign wants to zero in on. Expect Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris in just a short while to really hit that message of upholding the Constitution. You heard it in that clip you just played from Liz Cheney. We expect that message repeated quite a bit this afternoon, Kristen.
Gabe, you know, you and I sort through the polls all of the time. There's obviously just a tiny little sliver of undecided voters at this point in time, but those voters could make all of the difference. Does the Harris campaign think that Liz Cheney can help her win over those voters and even potentially change some moderate Republican minds?
Look, that's the big question, right? Look, we spoke with some Trump supporters earlier today. They say Liz Cheney does not speak for the modern Republican Party. That is clear. And she's not winning any, Trump supporters here, but yes, she's trying to look for that small sliver of the electorate that would either stay home because they're dissatisfied with both candidates, or perhaps somebody that backed Nikki Haley in the GOP primary and does not see a home for themselves in the party of Donald Trump. And as you said, in a state like Wisconsin that was so close back in 2020 and is expected to be just as close, if not more so this time around, that could make a huge difference in this swing state, Kristen.
Oh, it absolutely could. All right, Gabe Gutierrez, thank you for your reporting. We know you'll continue to monitor that event, bring us any big updates as we get them. Garrett, let me turn to you now. Of course, we've been reporting on former President Trump's response to this filing in the Jack Smith case. Walk us through what he is saying, and is there any concern among Republicans, Republican allies, that this could basically backfire on the former president? Because, boy, he's spending a lot of time talking about how the 2020 election was rigged, and we know that Republicans are saying, let's look forward, let's focus on 2024, not those baseless claims.
Yeah, Kristen, I think at this point, for the Trump campaign, at least their perspective on it is that your views on the 2020 election are pretty well baked in at this point. At this event I'm at now, Donald Trump made the same comments he often does. He described the 2020 election as rigged. He said if he thought he lost, he wouldn't be out here running again. But that's it. That's the only time he's mentioned anything close to the Smith filing or the cases against him. And he's been going now for almost an hour here on stage. I think the Trump campaign view and the Trump view is that these charges, this case, the discussion about January 6th and the 2020 election has lost some of its explosiveness as we approach 2024. They're not fundraising on it as aggressively. Donald Trump isn't talking about it as aggressively. I think it's clearly the kind of thing that can still get under his skin, as you heard in that interview from last night. But they don't see it as a seminal issue deciding this race. The Harris campaign clearly feels differently. They've been trying to highlight some of these elements, even by having Liz Cheney campaign with her.
Yeah, and early voting already underway in more than half the states. Let me read you a little clip of Jack Smith's filing. He writes, leading into the election, the defendant's private and campaign advisors informed him that it would be a close contest and that it was unlikely to be finalized on Election Day. Privately, the defendant told advisors he would simply declare victory before all the ballots were counted and any winner was projected. Garrett, what's the key takeaway there and the potential implications for this year's election?
Well, Kristen, I see much of the same kind of thing going on, at least publicly, from the candidate. Almost at every event, he talks about the idea that he thinks he can only lose this race if it were to be rigged. He talks about not needing turnout, not needing voters, needing to make sure there's not cheating, and basically saying that the only way he loses is if it gets stolen from him. He is certainly setting the table again to, declare victory or to declare that something about the 2024 race is fishy. You can probably see behind me the signs to vote early. This is another thing that kind of plays out in this same context. Trump's campaign often urges people to vote early to take advantage of absentee voting or voting by mail in the states where it's available, like here in Michigan, where folks got their ballots late last week, early this week, and could vote. Trump does that only in the most perfunctory manner in these speeches. A lot of those same dynamics from 2020 will be in play again as we start counting votes this November.
All right. Garrett Haake, you have been there every step on the campaign trail. We're just 33 days out, my friend. Thank you very much. Appreciate your reporting, as always. Joining me now is Chuck Rosenberg, a former U.S. attorney and former senior FBI official. He is also an NBC News legal analyst. Chuck, thank you so much for being here on a very significant day. Let's dive in and start with this allegation by Donald Trump that releasing this filing now is, in his words, quote, election interference. He says it's too close to Election Day under the DOJ's guidelines. Give us your take.
Yeah, the DOJ guidelines don't pertain here, Kristen. I think the answer is pretty simple. After the Supreme Court issued its immunity decision earlier this summer, there was something that both sides had to litigate in front of Judge Chutkan, the federal district judge overseeing the January 6th federal criminal prosecution. They had to litigate whether or not the acts in the indictment were private conduct, meaning prosecutable, not immune, or official conduct, meaning not prosecutable and immune. So there's litigation going on, and the Smith team merely filed their brief in front of the judge asking for that determination. They filed it under seal. That was proper. The judge is reviewing it. That's proper. The judge unsealed it. That's also proper. It's proper because all of the courts in the United States operate with a predisposition to making public anything that can be made public, Kristen. And so everyone's doing their job. And by the way, let me add one thing. Deciding to unseal it will be seen by some partisans as political. Deciding not to unseal it, deciding to keep it under wraps, will be seen by other partisans as political. And so what the judge did here is her job. She's handling a case on her docket. She's proceeding through the papers, managing the case, moving the case as she should. And to heck with what the partisans on either side say. Just do your job. That's what she's doing, Kristen.
Such important context as we think about the timing of this, Chuck. Let's talk about the argument now that Jack Smith makes in this filing. Again, this is in reaction to the Supreme Court ruling that did give sitting presidents immunity for official acts. Jack Smith, and please correct me if I'm not getting this right, but he's effectively saying the acts that he is bringing charges on were not official acts. He's making the case former President Trump did this in his capacity as a candidate. I'll read you a little part of the filing. He says, at one point, long after the defendant had begun spreading false fraud claims, a White House staffer traveling with the defendant overheard him tell family members that it doesn't matter if you won or lost the election, you still have to fight like hell. That's a direct quote. Effectively saying this is proof he knew that he had lost. And also these conversations, Jack Smith arguing, were in the capacity of him as a candidate.
Yeah, and that second point is so important here, Kristen. If it's private conduct, then it is not immune from prosecution, and the evidence of the private conduct could be adduced at a criminal trial. The problem is that the Supreme Court simply made a pronouncement. Official conduct is immune, unofficial conduct is not immune, it's fair game. And they left all the details for the district court judge to sort out. Pronouncing things is easy. Sorting it out is very, very hard. And so now both sides will have an opportunity to frame those questions for Judge Chutkan. You've seen the first salvo from the Smith team. They are claiming, and I think credibly, that the conduct that remains in the indictment is private, therefore prosecutable, in other words, not immune. The Trump team will have a shot at it. They will claim the opposite. But again, Judge Chutkan will have to sort it out, and that's a hard job, and it will take a long time.
Well, and the other piece of this that needs to be sorted out is the fact that Jack Smith, of course, focuses quite heavily on former President Trump's interactions with his vice president, Mike Pence. The fact that he was leaning on him to try to overturn the results of the election. The counterpoint to that, Trump allies would argue, is every conversation between the president and his vice president are in an official capacity. Does that argument hold water? What do you make of that?
It very well may. I mean, I think that's the hardest part for the Smith team in this litigation at the moment, Kristen. Conversations with purely private actors, political operatives, even state officials, if it's about the campaign and Mr. Trump's candidacy, are arguably private conduct. But you're quite right. I think the weak point for the Smith team here, and it's not their fault, this is simply the facts they've been dealt, and they're trying to litigate it. But I think the weak point for the Smith team are conversations between Mr. Trump and his vice president. We know the Supreme Court has already put off, or put out of bounds, I should say, Kristen, conversations, for instance, between Mr. Trump and senior Justice Department officials. And so the Trump folks, the Trump lawyers, will argue that the same rule should pertain to conversations between Mr. Trump and his then Vice President Mike Pence. We'll see, but this is exactly the point we were discussing earlier. The Supreme Court pronounces, and now Judge Chutkan has to sort it out. And I think you put your finger directly on one of the most difficult questions with which she will have to contend.
And Chuck, just finally, very quickly, what's the timeline? What are you going to be watching for next?
Well, the next thing that happens is a Trump response, and then I imagine that Judge Chutkan either rules on the papers, meaning without a hearing, or holds a hearing to ask additional questions and try and sort through it. But whichever path they choose, it's not going to be particularly fast, Kristen.
All right. Chuck Rosenberg, as always, thank you so much for helping us with these complicated legal stories. We really appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.